Hey, Peter. Thanks so much for putting this together and sharing your thoughts for the MRV Day event. Yeah, curious to do a deep dive in this map you made. What have you got here, man?
Hey, John, thanks so much for taking the time to chat and happy to contribute in any way I can, both to the larger ReFi community and also to MRV Day. Pretty excited about that. So I kind of I guess there's some backstory here, but about a year and a half ago, the company I worked at, which was then called the Future Forest Company and is now called Undo, was starting to look at kind of um, how we might make use of crypto and blockchain specifically to help push forward kind of uh, who and how we can finance our work and how do we get to scale? How do we close the gap between the demand for carbon dioxide removals and the current supply, right? So you have this crazy situation in which a compounding group of corporate buyers is looking to buy an increasingly large amount of carbon removals that essentially don't exist. And everyone's kind of going like, oh, okay, we're going to make this work. And you see all these markets going on up online and saying like, we're going to be a market. And pretty quickly they're transitioning into kind of sourcing projects. And as this was all going on, I was kind of thinking like, wow, this would be really cool to get going on refi and you start seeing these companies pop up and ultimately it was just extremely hard for a project developer without a crypto background to figure out who was doing what. And so at the time, there frankly wasn't a lot of people doing much of anything. John, you were like one of the first people I talked to. Um, and frankly, I kind of was trying to sort through this and start to get to a place where it's like, all right, who who has a registry and how does this actually work? And so I kind of made this map for myself, and mostly over the course of the last couple of months. Um, and most of the companies that you see here are really, really, really new. And so, it's even you'll see a little OGs here. Like even Regen isn't that old. I mean, the real OGs are Vera, and they're not on chain. So, just kind of as you can see here, unofficial and unapproved map. There's a lot of stuff here that I'm just kind of guessing at, and I'm trying to do that as a message to my past self to say, hey, here's some information. Here's at least the things to look at. So just in terms of breaking down kind of who does what, right? If you were just to imagine, instead of thinking about a lot of the maps that I've seen in refi, like these are what these different organizations are trying to be. Okay, this person's looking at MRV, this person's looking at marketplace. I was trying to think about it as a user case, right? And thinking specifically from a project development standpoint. If I'm a project developer or I'm somewhere in the carbon chain, what are the different steps that we need to take? So I'm just going to kind of run through this with Vera, but you can kind of see you can see this whole chain. So Vera traditionally is the person who created methodologies. There's a little description of each of these stages here. So, Crowaback standards are kind of gold standard Vera. It's a really typical off-chain. Red is the color that signifies off-chain here. And there's kind of like details here. You can click through and see how Vera does methodologies. Project origination is typically sourced through third-party, project developers or broker buyers. So these are when you're going, okay, let's actually do some work. A project developer will meet with someone who can talk them through that process and plan out the number of tons and how they might go to market and that kind of thing. From there, with that information, they go back to a place like Vera and they say, okay, we've got our information for this project. Can you tell us how much this is all going to be worth so we can go get pre-financing? And so that delivers them into the project financing level, which traditionally most of the project developers are not dealing with big lumps of cash that they can say, okay, what do we want to do next? They're going out and saying, okay, let's see if we can sell this project, and then once we have the money, we'll go back, we'll run the project. From there, there's obviously the question of both measurement. I've broken MRV, traditionally monitoring, verification, and reporting, into two steps, as in the measurement process and the verification and reporting process. This came out of feedback from the guys at Open Forest Protocol because they have definitely separated those processes, which I think was super interesting. And then you get into verification and reporting. This is this is where Vera sits, right? You need to get by the methodology, pre-certify if you do want to do that, or you can submit your project as a, for verification. And at that point, after passing verification, you get to carbon issuance. So typically, this is where Vera would create the carbon credits you're going to sell in a registry and then sell them, right? Those enter the registry, and then after that, there are these kind of more DeFi concepts like pooling, and then B2C and B2B sales. So I kind of tried to break that down just so that you could say, okay, well I kind of have a feel for where Vera sits, right? But I think there's some interesting kind of points of departure, right? So Vera methodologies are currently being ported over to, open source protocols adapting a Vera meth, and the Regen network are actually kind of porting over some existing Vera methodologies. So I tried to have a little information here that you guys can click through on, and I'm going to continue to add to this as I understand more. Hopefully my past self really appreciates all the work that I'm doing on his behalf. So you can kind of see that there are these different ways that you can imagine interacting, right? So you have these points of departure around the methodology. And then you also have these interesting things that just kind of like when people think about ReFi, right? They don't necessarily think about that full stack, right? The idea of native carbon isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, particularly around, particularly with the kind of scaling around Toucan, Klima, and recent fundraisers by Moss Flow. So as you can see, this is kind of spawned out of the Vera registry, right? And I think what I was trying to create is show people, hey, when people talk about a bridge, what they're talking about is bridging from one registry, the Vera registry, into another, Toucan's registry, or Flow Carbon's registry, and provide a little bit of context around here. I invite anyone and everyone to leave little like notes, like Alex did here, really, really helpful to want this to be a living document. And what you have here is just little details. Okay, what does Toucan's pool look like? Well, they're porting, they're bridging Vera credits. They're pulling them into the registry. They now have a couple pools. Same thing. Flow Carbon's doing the same thing over here. Moss is doing a slightly different thing, but they have this idea of pooling, which isn't necessarily something that exists off chains. That's why you don't see it here, for example. And then, you have these pools then being accessible, either, generally kind of in the form of Moss or Flow Carbon. These are then traded, in a DEX, whereas Klima and Klima Infinity have kind of direct sales. You can go to their site, you can buy on their site. So kind of zooming out a little bit, the basic idea is kind of just to give people an idea of, okay, if we're going to be doing a project and we need pre-cert because we don't want to go through Vera, how do we do that, right? Well, currently, those things are not things that you can do on some platforms, but I just recently actually got to update this. I just recently talked to Stenver, and he's like, all right, we can actually do some of the project pre-certification. And I was talking to guys at Green Trade.
Stenver at Solid World, yeah.
Yep, Stenver at Solid World, and I was talking to Ulf from Green Trade, and similar kind of things. This idea of, hey, maybe there's this piece that we can get into. So just trying to provide a little bit of context around these pieces. And then I think, I tried to kind of keep one side separated from the other side. So project developers really want money kind of now to do work in the future. And I actually think that's going to be kind of a key piece of the carbon market going forward. But typically everything you see on the left here, this is all current, this is all market for carbon that exists, right? Whereas over here on this side kind of is starting to fade towards carbon that will exist. So instead of, the pooling that's going to happen that Solid World is doing is pooling of future carbon, right? Instead of pooling of existing carbon. And I think that's a really interesting kind of differentiation, even though from a practical perspective, they're both pooling things that carbon tons in some sense. So on this side, I tried to include some of the stuff that is either launching or near launching. Sequester, Solid World, Green Trade, Senken, Good Carbon, Thallow, Ivy, Mycore, which I think just got renamed. But a bunch of these are kind of what I would consider next gen kind of carbon platforms, and a lot of them are tackling the very interesting question in my mind of how to make the carbon future market work. Um, so yeah, so again, I think this is very much just a what I hope will be something that people find useful, just even as a way to think about these markets. And hopefully we can keep this up to date enough that it can be useful for investors who are entering the space and just kind of want to get their head around things, or other members of the market that are going, okay, well, how do we plug into all these other players? Um, Now, there are a lot of people that I have not included here. Biodiversity plays, plastic in the ocean, conservation work, endangered species, all kinds of things like that. Tried to focus it just on the carbon supply chain within the refi space. And as you can
Yeah,
see here,
absolutely.
just trying to kind of understand, who's going to be on what chain, as that is
Yeah.
something that I think will be really helpful. So yeah, would love any and all feedback, and expect to continue working on this, either in this form or with partners who are excited about kind of working on this stuff going forward.
And how about for you guys particularly? I know you were talking about your journey of starting off looking at a variety of methodologies and then deciding to narrow towards enhanced rock weathering.
Mm,
Where does methodology development come in this cycle when actors like Vera seem to be, I don't know what the correct word is, but maybe not able to move at the rate that these methodologies are developing, especially for the removal side where the science is new and everything's unproven. Like, how does that fit into this mix, especially for you guys as you're looking how ReFi relates to your method?
yeah, so. I guess I view them as kind of different infrastructure challenges, right? So you have challenges that relate to the structure of the sales agreements, right? So if you think about the work that I just talked through, um, what we would love to get to is a way in which we don't have to have a bilateral binding legal agreement between us and whoever we want to sell, whatever counterparty we want to sell forward carbon to, because that really is how we're going to scale as a company that needs to have cash in order to do the work. Like so many, um, I guess it's essentially all carbon work happens this way. You need money up front in order to be able to deliver carbon. Um, and so clicking that piece into place, where it's not all just bilateral agreements over and over again. We can actually start to say, okay, we're going to do it this way and we're going to have access to a lot more people, is one piece of that infrastructure. And as you say, the other piece is kind of the actual MRV challenge. Um, and I would break that problem into two pieces. So there's fundamental science questions, and then there's kind of like operational go-to-market, bureaucratic kind of questions. Um, and so I think the uh, the science for non-metered approaches, so you have metered being like DAC, injection, things like that, where you can actually, there's like a nozzle through which carbon dioxide is passing, and you can have a little thing that says like, here's exactly how much you've done, right? That's great. The level of scientific certainty there is going to be super high. Um, but at least in my mind, scalability of it is not infinite. So we need other ways of doing this work. Now you're going to get in nature-based environments, so metered on one side, non-metered on the other, all the nature-based, including all the enhanced rock weathering, ocean weathering, ocean alkalinity, all that stuff happens in the natural environment, and so therefore you cannot be metered. Um, and and all that kind of stuff. There are real basic science questions that offer you increasing certainty. And so I think what I think is very interesting is that the science that we have right now suggests with a high degree of certainty that what we want to happen, i.e., carbon is being stored long term, is there, and what we need to do is slowly um, diminish our required buffer. And so in any kind of a non-metered environment, your goal is to get to a place in which your answer, how many tons of carbon did you store, is within plus or minus a very small amount. And right now it's more, right? We have larger buffers because we want to be really, we're working with kind of early stage technology. We want to make sure that the carbon we're selling isn't kind of provisional, like we hope this is going through, but is definitely going to be there. And if we overperform, that's great. But from a business perspective, we want to sell as much as we can. So our job from a science perspective is to push that buffer down and down and down. So that science is not going to go away. It's any sort of marginal gain that allows us to diminish a buffer and to consequently sell more carbon has value, right? And so we have a science team that's working really hard to deliver the science that meets the bar, the minimum bar. But we're not going to stop, and I expect other people that are dealing with these in these the kind of scientific, the kind of open ecosystem realm are in the same position, right? Like we want to hit a minimum bar so we can get to verification, but also we want to keep going past that so we develop really, really high levels of certainty, across a lot of different types of environments, geographic and environmental and so on. Um, so from a science perspective, we're just pushing. We're just pushing as much as we can all the time. And then there's the last piece, which is the kind of bureaucratic MRV process, which um, I view as there are kind of different layers, right? And I think what you see in terms of these kind of early stage hard tech companies, Climeworks, Charm, our work at Undo, a lot of them are opting for ISO based verification methodologies as both kind of an IP protection strategy, but also a way of proving the underlying science while getting to market quickly. And fundamentally, um, nearly all of our buyers and most of Climeworks, Charm, and Heirloom, et cetera, they're dealing with one counterparty. They're selling directly to a corporate body. So what they need to do is provide, the corporate party with the level of certainty that that party requires. And so instead of trying to hit kind of like an open market concept, we're trying to find the level of certainty that allows us to go to market quickly. So a lot of these companies are pursuing, and as we are, ISO certification, and then kind of with this, we'll continue doing the same thing, but we'll pass it by increasingly more traditional filters, ending up kind of certified by Vera and all that kind of jazz. Um, so yeah, so I mean, that's kind of a long answer to what I think is actually a pretty complicated question. Um, so yeah, so that's how we think about it.
Nice. And I know that you've been diving deep into this space, and I really appreciated, yeah, the kind of perspective you shared around some of the trends in refi where people are looking for problems to solve and sometimes being disconnected from those problems. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to narrow in on MRV as a pursuit to really, support the movement in its growth and integrity is to really encourage those conversations between project developers who are actually developing the science and recognizing these real world challenges with this brilliant ecosystem of experimenters using the power of Web3. Like, what do you see as kind of the cultural clash and tensions between those different groups? And, what would your recommendations be to early stage founders entering this space looking for ways to make an impact?
So I think it's a good question. I think there are some really interesting um, ways that people are trying to uh, kind of adjust their expectations as they get closer to the problem. Like I think a lot of the people who entered refi kind of thought about some of the kind of exciting things that the side kind of philosophical underpinnings of refi of like, oh, planet positive money and kind of replacing the petrodollar with really something that could be really transformational. Um, and while I think that work is conceptually really interesting and really fun to think about, it's really, really far from what a project developer needs. And um, And I think we've seen a lot of platforms that are like, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to be, whatever, Amazon um, carbon, or we're gonna be the, X layer, right, from a non refi um, analogy. We're going to plug it into refi. It's going to be amazing. And I think we've all kind of seen them all migrate toward the actual problem because they need to. And those problems, in my mind, are um, project finance and MRV. Those are your two major problems. And I think kind of everything else relative to climate is kind of window dressing. Um, and so, I think you see like, Patch and Carbon Future and Puro and a lot of these kind of next gen carbon platforms were like, hey, we're gonna be this major exchange. We're gonna sell. We're just gonna be a broker. It's gonna be amazing. And all of them have ended up in supply side kind of um, trying to build supply. And and I think, the next wave of these companies will end up doing the same thing around both project finance and MRV. And I think, you know, that to me is where these tools are useful. I think I'm a little bit happy that we're in a bear cycle because people were focused on utility and not speculation. And and so the stuff that happens after, I think people can get really excited about using carbon as assets to trade and do all kinds of things like that. I think if you went and talked to a project developer, they'd be like, "That's cool. I don't need additional upside after my project is out in the market. What I want to be able to do is focus on my work. And in order to do that, I need money, and I need it now, and I need it in fiat. I don't need, crypto hedging risk with long-term upside, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to become an expert in those things. And so those are kind of like, I guess what I hope is people entering this space will think about this as fundamentally a supply side problem that can be majorly alleviated with really cool tools, and that those are the tools that we should be trying to build.
And just narrowing into the MRV side of those two fundamental problems you mentioned, I'm curious to get your thoughts around like the spectrum of centralization and decentralization. I know there's a lot of Web3 enthusiasts who are super passionate about decentralization, but understanding your guys' specific example of pioneering a methodology, there's a level of centralization that's required as you go through this process, both to define the science and then measure and ensure that it's happening. And like you described earlier, the corporate buyers are really the ones setting the precedent and the threshold and the standard. And so there's a really small number of actors that are involved in this. And as long as a corporate buyer is willing to pay for it upon the agreement, the bilateral agreement that you set, then you guys are good to go, right? You've got your money, you're moving.
Exactly.
So help us understand what your kind of hypothesis is, maybe longer term, about how this plays out and like why you've decided to engage with Web3 versus just saying, oh, it's cool, we'll just focus on the corporate buying side, and specifically how it relates to MRV and what we need to do to address, climate in the first place.
Yeah, so I think those are maybe two different questions. Just the why bother with Web3, and then the other one is kind of decentralization, um, and MRV challenges. I think people are really concerned with the kind of meta level conversation around MRV. Like, how do you make this um, really, really scale? And I think that's a super interesting question. But again, project developers are not interested in the meta level, right? They need to get their product certified by someone who is acceptable to their buyer. And so, I tweeted out recently, I was like, oh, can we build Rotten Tomatoes for carbon producers, right? And it was like, okay, cool, right? And that would be fun. And also, if a corporate buyer looks at the carbon Rotten Tomato rating, and they take that as something that they can trust, then great, cool, let's rock. But if they're like, no, okay, this is just random people on the internet, deciding whether these guys are like that's not good enough. Like I work at E&Y or I work at Deloitte and like no, we need something else. And so I think there are kind of almost two paths, right? And there's this like what is the best way and what is the project developer relevant way. And the best way, at least in my mind, does involve a really serious amount of decentralization, right? And long term, getting to a place where um, there's some combination of data from the field coming in and reputational peer reputation and buyer reputation and performance of products and things like that that give you a sense of what it is that you're buying. That feels much better to me than a super rigorous MRV standard that is kind of like um, I don't know, really parameterized, right? Because ultimately we want if we have any chance of reaching our climate goals, we want people to do really weird stuff, like and really try some stuff. And if we're like, no, you have to measure it, right? If someone were to come to us and say, you have to be able to tell us down to the hundredth of a ton exactly how much carbon is coming out of the atmosphere at any given point in time, like we don't have that level of certainty. So should we stop? And so I feel really like I certainly don't want to stop. And I certainly don't think it would be appropriate to go to the people that are like, all right, we're going to do pioneering biodiversity work and be like, unless you can tell me exactly how many howler monkeys are on your property in Costa Rica, like unless you're right, I can't pay for it. Like that doesn't work, right? And so in some
Yeah.
sense, like having a decentralized method that allows for this kind of more fungibility, a little more fungibility and a little bit more risk taking, is both really appealing and makes a ton of sense. But bridging that gap from like that's the really cool end state that would be amazing to get to, and like if we put one of our projects up and then like five people, one of them is a professor and they give our thing a rubber stamp, but it's just like Bob from University of Arizona or God knows what, right? And they're like, cool. And then four other people from the internet are like, yeah, this guy's awesome, right? And then we go to, so we go to partner, we go to whatever, McDonald's or something, and we're like, all right, McDonald's, look at the thing, right? You got to trust that. And they'll be like, we don't. Like it's hard to get the minimum viable product for a decentralized MRV system is I think tough, and I think coming up with that is a really interesting idea.
Awesome, man. So fun. Well, thanks for carving time out to make this model and this map as a public good for people like yourself entering the space. I found it incredibly insightful, making sense of it. And yeah, just very grateful to have you here. I think people like you who are willing to span the gap and look past the kind of speculative, crazy culture of Web3 into the essence of, the promise of what's possible is great. And we need more project developers who are willing to share what their real expectations and real needs are, and we need more people in Web3 listening to them and saying, okay, well, this is the most important thing. And because time is running out, sometimes you have to balance the dimensions of precision and scale. We need to scale climate action in a very short time frame, and I think we can improve those precision levers over time. Is there anything else you want to leave people with as we kind of wrap up this little exhibit in MRV Day?
No, I think yeah, I think the one thing that I would want people to take away is that last point, is that it's just that we're under time pressure, and so there's this like we're allowed to invent the future right now, and I think there is um, I think specifically the work around kind of MRV and futures is an enormous opportunity to actually do all the cool stuff with smart contracts that people are like, we've got all these smart contracts, they can do these amazing things. And we're like currently using them to kind of like trade commodities. And I'm like, no, it's a smart contract. Like, let's use them. They can do amazing things. So getting to a place where we're like leaning into that and then spending the time being like, all right, let's try to do some more adventurous stuff. And I think that to me is like, there's going to be a lot of projects that don't work in this space. And I think the luxury of refi and this moment is time is like, we're going to have to try some stuff, and it's going to have to happen fast. So yeah, like I really, I hope everyone, can jump in on this. And I hope what we see is like ideas winning out and consolidating around kind of progress, so that the whole field has a shot at making it to gigaton scale in 15 years. It seems like an insane thing to think about, but that's where I think the market can and should be.
Awesome. Peter, you're the man. Thanks so much for this gift. I really appreciate it. Enjoy every minute I get with you. We'll leave it a wrap for here. And yeah, dude, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, really appreciate you spending time.